Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Regional Conference on Migration. Renan, maybe thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Regional Conference on Migration. Today, we're going to start with the virtual conferences cycle on this challenge on the contributions of companies. We are very pleased to be able to conduct this on the mandate of the ministers and vice ministers during the 24th meeting of the Regional Conference on Migration that took place on November last year in Guatemala, where we agreed to conduct this forum on the private sector and labor migration. Due to the circumstances of this difficult year that we've all had, we adopted these virtual conferences or virtual conferences, thanks to the support of the IOM, ILO, UNDP, and their International Organization of Entrepreneurs. We started on these virtual conferences on labor migration and the challenge of economic recovery, contributions of the public sector and companies, and we are very glad to have representatives of the 11 members of the RCM, civil society, and of servants, and we would like to welcome all those organizations and institutions that traditionally have been with us on all the events of CRM, like the ministries of labor and members of groups of work on labor migrations that are part of the CRM, and all the organizations of employers that are here with us this morning. We have at the main table Daguer Hernandez, the Deputy Director of Migration and Foreign Affairs of CR in the capacity of Presidency Pro Tempore of RCM, Maria Paz Anzoregui, Director of the International Organization of Employers, Marcelo Pisani, and Marcelo is the Director of Central America and the Caribbean, Leonardo Ferreira, Deputy Director of the International Labour Organization Office for Central America, and for Haiti, Panama, and Dominican Republic. And we also have Mrs. Diana Gutierrez, Director of the Global Companies Program for Gender Equality of the UNDP. I am Luis Alonso Serrano, Executive Secretary of the CRM. And we will now give the floor to Mr. Daguer Hernandez, Deputy Director of Migration and Foreign Affairs of the Temporary Presidency. Thank you, and good morning, everyone, all country members of CRM, and good morning, Maria Paz Anzoregui, Marcelo Pisani, Leonardo Ferreira, and representatives of the UNDP. Part of what we are trying to do of the pro tempore presidency and the reason why we are here because of this pandemic is this modification in the format that Luis Antonio Serrano just mentioned, in the sense that we are all working and doing things remotely, which gives us an advantage because we can work from everywhere, from any office. In my case, I am out on the field or out of the metropolitan area, out of the city, and this is why I'm here in an open space, as you can see. So we, in our countries, even before this pandemic and before the health problems that we have had to face these years, we had problems that had not been solved, such as unemployment, poverty, non-compliance with the work rights, and other problems that could have been resulting in some crimes. And we also had need for labor in other countries. And we have some needs for labor and to acquire foreign labor to comply with certain qualified labor and other things in our economies. And I think that this labor in many occasions and in many countries had some characteristics that were like disorderly and irregular in some occasions, which reflect the need for many companies. And the problem is that with this type of labor and these irregularities, it reflected that impossibility to get that labor. So the companies needed to resort to that labor that they could get. So this COVID visualized this need and those problems. So there was more poverty, more unemployment, and also employers for this labor. So I think that there is this space for reflection that is going to allow for to reflect upon all these things, because the need for labor or the need for work are intertwined. So I think that this conference is going to give us an opportunity to be able to have this conversation between the countries, between the members of the CRM, and to put on the table all the possibilities that we have. This possibility that COVID is giving us to rethink this labor migration, and for the states along with employers to work together to provoke this economic growth of the countries from now on. I think that this pandemic or the COVID can be gone in a year or two when we find this vaccine that is going to solve this health issue. But the economic problem is going to take as much as we take, or it takes us to find a solution for labor migration, which is necessary for the economic solution for our countries. Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Director Hernandez. And now I am pleased to welcome Maria Paz Azoregoy. She is the Director International Employers Organization. So thank you for being here today. Thank you. Can you hear me? Well, you can go to Buenos.
Of this conversation today. Thank you very much, Mr. Hernandez, for your opening remarks on behalf of the Presidency Pro Tempore of the RCM. I want to welcome the distinguished representatives from IOM, ILO, UNDP. On behalf of the International Organization of Employers, let me thank the RCM member states, the UN agency and employer organization representatives for participating in today's event, which will focus on employers' priorities on labor migration. Well before the COVID-19 pandemic, the IOE has been working very closely with its members, which are the most representative employer organization in more than 150 countries, on a wide range of matters that affect businesses. And this includes, of course, the issue of labor migration. IOE works on a number of initiatives aiming at improving regulatory frameworks conducive to labor mobility while reducing exploitative recruitment practices. We have, for example, a policy working group on labor migration chaired by Ms. Ronnie Goldberg, which we will have the honor to listen later today. Additionally, and many of you know, IOE hosts and coordinates the Business Advisory Group on Migration to the Global Forum for Migration and Development through the business mechanism, which focuses on enhancing dialogue between private sector and governments to promote all-inclusive migration policies and frameworks at national, but also at regional and global level. Employers regard regular migration as a necessary and positive phenomenon. It is for us a vehicle for fulfilling personal aspiration, for balancing labor supply and demand, for sparkling innovation, and for transferring and spreading skills. Employers benefit from clear, transparent, and efficient national immigration laws and policies that permit the movement of workers when and where they are needed. The experience of businesses with the practical workings of immigration policies, as well as knowledge of emerging markets and staffing trends, can supply important information to governments and international organizations and enhance migration governance. Thus, the participation of the private sector, of employer organizations in public-private dialogues like the one we are having today is for us essential, and it's for us essential to the development of well-regulated migration systems. As we all know, labor migration can raise complex and sensitive political, economic, and social concerns, as well as a variety of legal and regulatory challenges. COVID-19 is adding new dimensions to the labor migration governance and to cross-border mobility. Labor market protectionism, narrow-minded policies, and xenophobic discourse pose challenges to efficient migration pathways with devastating consequences for businesses as it becomes difficult for employers to hire cross-border talent. The concept note that was put together for today's event identified 3 topics on which I would like to share some very brief remarks. The first topic is on talent mobility to address workforce deficits. And here I would like to reinforce the idea that continued access to the right skills and experience is a business priority. The current crisis has indeed impacted on labor mobility and highlighted many systemic inconsistencies in labor migration governance at global, but also at regional and national level. The myth that countries can be self-reliant and meet the domestic skills requirement for business to perform and function to the optimal level has been busted. Businesses need talent mobility through transparent and predictable environment which promotes regular pathway for migration. But for this to happen, in our view, businesses and governments as a whole, and by this I mean ministers of foreign affairs, labor minister, education ministers, skills development ministries, health, etc., should engage in discussions to understand really what are the business needs. They should discuss to try to find ways to close the skills gaps and to ensure that all those willing workers have opportunities for work. On the second topic that was identified in the note put together for today's discussion, and this is fair and ethical recruitment, we want to flag that, as many of you know, various studies have recorded evidence that inadequate regulatory frameworks can lead to issues like smuggling, human trafficking, forced labor abuse, and discrimination. We believe that appropriate legislation and policies on employment and recruitment should apply to all workers, labor recruiters, and employers. Recruitment should respect the applicable national laws and regulations of countries of origin, but also transit and destination, while respecting the relevant up-to-date international labor standards and promote a gender-responsive approach to labor migration governance. Finally, on the third topic, which is new technologies and entrepreneurship and migration, I think it's important to flag that the migration landscape is changing very fast as a consequence to new technologies, which are triggering not only new forms of work, but also entrepreneurship opportunities. The scope to use technology and innovation in migration government is also very important. And this goes from online visa processing systems, creating and strengthening profiling tools, mutual skills recognition procedures, training, ways to reduce cost of remittance, promote startups to come up with ideas and solutions for migration management. So technology is really impacting the migration landscape, and in our view, can make a very important contribution to migration governance. I think we can all agree that today we face a reality where the global economy must be rebuilt, companies need to be restarted and revitalized, supply chains need to be redesigned, and markets need to be reinvented. And this cannot happen without the support of governments, of course. And this brings me to my initial point, that more than ever before, governments, and also the ones including in the Puebla process, need to dialogue with businesses also on regular migration. For us, for the IOE, enhance and determine collaboration between governments, international organizations, and representative of employer organizations is more important than ever. And this is necessary if we are aiming at a quick, strong, and resilient private sector-led recovery for this crisis, and to build a better future, leaving no one behind. And there are some questions that come to mind that we think that could trigger perhaps the debate today. Do the labor migration policies adequately respond to the business needs for employment creation? How can businesses both in sending but also in transition and receiving countries work together with their governments as fundamental partners to respond to skill gaps in their economies? What are the main challenges? What good examples can we identify in today's dialogue to strengthen this collaboration? I really trust that these and many other relevant questions, what you will hopefully raise today, will form part of the exchanges and possibly trigger solutions during the next two dialogues on the 26th of August and on the 2nd of September with governments and international organizations. I would encourage you to kindly be present during the next two sessions to take the discussion further. I would like to close just by thanking the organizers of this virtual conference, and for those that are joining us. I really look forward to a rich and thought-provoking discussion from the representatives of international organizations and also from our very distinguished business representatives from USAIB, from CACIF in Guatemala, CONCAMIN in Mexico, and UCAEP, Costa Rica. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a usted, señora.
Anne Sorriguy, Regional Director of the International Organization of Employers, and thank you for reminding us of the dates of the virtual conferences. And now we'll continue with Marcelo Pisani. Thank you. I would like to start by greeting my colleagues, Daggett Hernandez, our great ally from IOM, Director General of Migration, Maria Paz Ansorriguy, Leonardo Ferreira, Luis Alonso, of course. I am very pleased to be able to participate in this opening session of the virtual conferences cycle with the employer sector in the framework of the Regional Migration Conference. We've seen that a significant percentage of migration is a result of the lack of balance in the economic development and in people that are looking for better conditions of life. As we all know, this is one of the more dynamic regions regarding the migration flow, if you all know. In here we have all types of migrants, from African, Asian, but also Haitian, Cuban. We have approximately 2,500 migrants living in shelters in Panama, and from Venezuela, living in Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, and Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, from the US. And you know that and the per capita income I don't know, in the US, we're talking about 62,000 per year, and local movements, but not less important, from the indigenous groups that come to work here, from Panama, Nicaraguans that also come to work and during harvesting. That is going to begin in December. Dominican Republic, all the Haitians that are going back to Dominican Republic. So I think that COVID is putting more pressure in the countries to tend to the needs of migrants, that due to the vulnerabilities, they have lost their sources of income, even though some of them have been resilient and have adapted on their own. But I think that tomorrow, under the regional program in Mesoamerica and the Caribbean program financed by PRM. So I would dare to think that globally, employers from all productive sectors are facing one of the most complex things. So in this uncertainty, I think that how to start this program and how to turn this into a key element for the social, and how to turn to this into this important thing on behalf and something that will be for the long range. And I think that this I think that we are going to try to find effective and efficient responses to these questions. And we'll start by listening to the expectations of the employer sector today. We at IOM are convinced that when well managed, this can be a trigger for migrants and communities in both destination transit countries. In order to have good governance of migration, we need some conditions among which we have long-lasting relationships. So concerted actions are very important when it comes to the prevention and tending to the promotion of long-lasting solutions for sustainable development. And this is why we have the 2030 Agenda, which should be an important reference point. Socioeconomic reconstruction in the current context of the pandemic should consider important actions in this sense, such as the use of labor migration instruments to meet labor needs in those key economic sectors such as tourism, transportation, and trade, which have been strongly affected by the pandemic. The strengthening of the existing regulatory frameworks to promote fair and ethical recruitment and ensure its effective implementation, taking into consideration the expectation and needs of the employer sector. The promotion of ties between new technologies, entrepreneurship, and labor migration management. As indicated, we reaffirm the support to these migrant groups through and our interest in strengthening the joint work with the entrepreneur sector. The action plan of this group is in line with our working priorities and our regional strategies, and is consistent with the efforts that we have been carrying out in the groups. First, with the workshop for consular authorities, then with the workshop on labor migration policies in Mexico, and last on ethical recruitment in Guatemala back in 2019. To conclude, I would like to thank the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, which support to the regional migration program Mesoamerica Caribbean made possible this virtual conferences cycle. In like manner, I would like to recognize the valuable efforts of the agencies represented here, which main purpose is to enhance the contribution of labor migration to the socioeconomic response our countries demand. I would like to end with a reflection that I think is necessary for this space, which is how the logic of the private sector for the creation of richness and the vision of capitalists in the context of poor countries goes along with the vision of organizations such as IOM that look after how we can have a win-win situation for these two main stakeholders. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pisani, for your words, and thank you. And I would like to thank the ION for the support for this activity. Now I would like to welcome Mr. Leonardo Ferreira, Deputy Director of the ILO for Central America, IT, Panama, and Dominican Republic. Welcome, Mr. Ferreira. Thank you, and good morning. I would like to greet Mr. Dagger Hernandez, Deputy Director and also of Migration, Mrs. Maria Paz Anzorregay, Director of IOE, Marcelo Pesani, Regional Director of IOM, Diana Gutierrez, from the Global Program of Employers for Gender Equality of UNDP. It is a great honor to represent the ILO here and this activity organized by RCM to start this cycle of virtual conferences to develop along with the IOM, UNDP, and ILO this virtual conferences cycle on this challenge on economic recovery, contributions of the public sector and companies, the involvement of the employer sector on labor migration is fundamental if we would like to advance towards the formulation of public policies, policies that will be coherent and sustainable. In terms of consensus, I think that it's possible to attain this only through the systematic exercise of social dialogue along with the stakeholders in the market, which also need the strengthening of consultation mechanisms to design policies, action plans, and migration legislation. And we need to consider the points of view of the different sectors involved. So the space generated through the RCM with this cycle of conferences is going to be a very good example of government dialogue along with the involvement of the employer sector. And it will be enriched with the participation of the civil society as well. Its regional character is going to allow to expand the discussions and conclusions reached to a supranational level, and it will contribute to a better governance of labor migration. Coherence in terms of consensus of policies will be attained by linking the needs of the labor market along with migration, and these efforts will be developed along with the agreement of the ILO regarding the different workers, and also Agreement 189 along about domestic workers without being a specific agreement on migration, but it encompasses some issues regarding mobility and emphasizes the need to consult the organizations that represent workers regarding a social policy that will allow migrant workers and their families to enjoy the different benefits that the nationals have. Respecting equal opportunities. And there is a special relevance when it comes to equal recruitment promoted by ILO. And also the legislation is looking after this productive dynamic in order to ensure correspondence regarding the offer and demand for labor, regarding the required skills to prevent displacement of the national task force, and that is something that we need to have in agreements to guarantee safe and orderly displacement. Migration legislation should have a law in in accordance with the productive sectors where we have the migrant population that will include workers, employers, and host communities. And finally, sustainability that will be attained on one hand through the consensus reached by the social actors, and on the other, through the institutionalization of measures, standards, and policies adopted from the social dialogue process. And this is going to guarantee the legitimacy and transparency regarding the decision making to face the challenges that the pandemic poses upon us, and also concerted action between all sectors. And I think this is going to help us face labor market problems, better conditions when it comes to health, work, and support to the entrepreneurial aspects and social protection, considering all the different environments when it comes to migrant workers. I especially celebrate the participation of the IOE in this forum because of the long standing participation on the social dialogue, and I would like to also take the opportunity to greet all the representatives, all the different organizations of employers, and all the regions covered by the RCM. And also our colleagues that ILO that have also joined this cycle, and I would like to thank them for their contribution as well. Thank you, Mr. Ferreira, for your words and representation of the ILO. And to close this first session, we would like to listen to Mrs. Diana Gutierrez on gender equality from UNDP. Good morning. Thank you, Luis Alonso. I would like to greet all the representatives, Maria Paz, representative of the IOE, Marcelo, Leonardo, as all the agencies in representation of, well, it's a pleasure for the UNDP to be here as part of this space, because I think that it's very relevant to reflect upon all of these topics and think about the role of the private sector, to reflect upon migration, because we are being affected by all this current situation when it comes to think about before and after COVID. If we make this reflection at UNDP, we started thinking about the impact that this crisis has had on the labor markets and the effects that this COVID is going to have in the future and the productive structure in the countries. We conducted a very interesting exercise to review some home service on the last years to see which has been the situation before COVID and the differences between men and women. And then we started using some other lenses to understand the situation of young women in the rural areas on heads of households. And we saw that as a result of the pandemic, 32% of women and 30% of men have not been able to work as a result of the stringent measures adopted to safeguard our health. It is a quarantine, the lockdowns, border lockdowns, all the trade closings has had an impact on the economic, I don't know, and that has been no exception. So we need to understand what is going on with the migrants and how they have been affected, and as a response, how we can support. And this is a commitment that we have at the United Nations to support the countries in the design of the social and economic responses. And as part of this reality, we know that the migrants in many occasions are, I don't know, much more vulnerable because they are not in their country of origin, but not only that, because their host countries, they have to face much more restrictions when it comes to the access and permanence to their labor markets. So they need to work in irregular conditions with no insurance. So the challenges that the crisis already have are much more difficult for them as migrants. And when we think about the reality of women migrants, because they have less time availability, and also the obligations because they don't earn money, and because of the lack of qualifications, so they don't have this talent mobility and there is no permanence. So let's think about this scenario by the end of this 2020. So all the projections from ECLAC, for example, this situation could lead to even more inequality, gender, and for example, as I was saying, this is going to affect migrants and especially women. And this is why we at UNDP, well, the Secretary General has wanted to us to support, as we have done for many years, to support the RCM and some other agencies to this to address all these challenges in the region, because we know that the migrant population, as some of you said, there is a great potential in terms of contributions made to the economies, not only on how to integrate to the task force, but also how everything can go back. For example, what they send, the remittances that they send to their countries of origin, how they can modify their productive matrices or grids. And we have been working hand in hand with some countries on strategies for the social and economic responses. And this is a challenges that is still there, but it's shared by all countries in the region, not only because of the challenges faced in terms of I don't know, threats to the I don't know, national health in the context that we have, or specifically for the migrant population, but there is this huge potential, as I said, for migrant population to be a part of that pathway to recovery, and they can integrate to this development or this culture. So I think that we would like to emphasize the support that we want to give all of them. We know that this is a crisis that with 3 times the impact. I know that this is a health crisis, but also an economic crisis. And we need to consider all the challenges and the reality that the migrants are going through. So I think that, I don't know, maybe there is we needed to take a more comprehensive look at all the interests and everything that they have gone through. And I think that it is going to affect women and men. And I think that it's fundamental to take a look at how we can develop measures, for example, the adoption of a universal basic income, cross-border things and subsidies that can reach the migrant population. And we need to consider identification, regularization of the migration status. It is crucial. And of course, the implementation of active policies for the labor market aimed at integrating the migration community. I think it's essential, and UNDP is committed to this effort. So thank you for this space, and thank you to the representatives of the private sector and the IOE, because we are trying to build an alliance, a very strong alliance, to ensure inclusion opportunities and to guarantee the 2030 agenda. so that no one's left behind. Thank you. Thank you, Diana, for your words. And again, I would like to thank the pro tempore presidency, the IOE, ILO, and ION for helping us on the organization of this RCM event. We're going to start with the panel with the representatives of the employers. So I would like to invite Mrs. Ronnie Goldberg. She will be conducting this session. So I would like to invite you all to continue. She's the president of the group of policies of the IOE on migration, United States Council for International Business. So Ronnie, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Much. Can you hear me? Okay. And
Yes, we
thank
can.
you. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to be here and to be moderating this very distinguished panel. There's a certain irony, I think, in the fact that we are here addressing mobility when COVID-19 has immobilized the world. And here we are frozen in our little boxes on these screens. A few weeks ago, The Economist magazine estimated that some 65,000 new rules affecting travel have been promulgated so far this year, many of them directed at labor mobility specifically. If you want to get a sense of what those look like and the challenges they pose to businesses, I invite you to go to the Fragaman law firm's website, which has an open section that contains some 150, more than 150 pages of restrictions on labor mobility specifically. These restrictions on movement have played a major role in the unprecedented collapse of economic activity and loss of employment affecting virtually every country in the world. Of course, restricting movement has affected more than just labor migration, and we have to be mindful of that. It has separated families, disappointed tourists, and devastated the businesses that serve them. It has disrupted the education of students, shattered the plans and dreams of many people seeking a better life abroad, and it's compounded the already formidable hardships facing refugees. But the end of labor mobility has posed its own significant costs. Let's just think of a few random examples. The precipitous fall in global remittance flows, and by the way, global remittances are 3 times bigger than foreign aid to poor countries, have compounded the plight of many families relying on the earnings of migrant relatives. Cross-border investment has been hobbled. Many businesses located near borders are closing because they depend on mobile labor. If their employees cannot commute, they cannot operate. Some key sectors, for example, agriculture or healthcare, are particularly dependent on migrants in many countries. Citizens are already feeling the strains, which can take the form of higher prices or even more dangerously, lack of services. Of course, at some point, the pandemic is going to end and economic activity is going to resume. But when it does, labor mobility will be a key component of the recovery. I liked what Senor Hernandez said at in the opening session. COVID has given us an opportunity to rethink labor migration. What are the challenges we're going to face in this regard? Well, some of the challenges we're going to inherit from pre-pandemic days, because migration systems in many places have not proven up to the task of responding to labor market needs. Some are hobbled by outdated technology or indeed no reliance on technology. Maria Paz mentioned just one small example. Think how helpful online visa processing would have been in the present context. Some migration systems are characterized by slow or unresponsive bureaucracies, by lack of transparency, by frequent changes when what business needs is stability. So these are all leftover issues and problems that we need to attack with, I think, renewed attention. But some challenges are going to be less tractable, and they're exacerbated by the pandemic. Foremost among these is the rise of xenophobia, protectionist sentiment, indeed outright bigotry, blaming migrants for health risks, for competing for scarce jobs, for draining government resources, are and will be used as excuses for maintaining restrictions on labor mobility that can only be counterproductive to economic recovery and business success. It is a delusion to believe that any country is self-sufficient. Let me give you just one tiny random factoid. Migrants constitute 14% of the United States population. They also account for 29% of our doctors and 40% of our life scientists. So every country in the world benefits from the skills, energy, innovation, entrepreneurship that migrants bring. Shutting borders is a sure recipe for decline in competitiveness and prosperity. Putting up a not welcome sign to workers at all skill levels, whether they are in agriculture and construction, or engineers, executives, IT experts, doctors, nurses, can only hold a country back. It will push investment and economic activity elsewhere, slow growth, and reduce job creation. So it's our job to see that this does not happen, and to work together to emerge from this unprecedented disaster with migration systems that are better than before, and that are fit for the immense challenge of recovery. As Maria Paz has said, the business community, the IOE, the business mechanism, all our members stand ready and willing to engage with workers, with civil society, and most of all with our governments to ensure migration policies are fit for purpose, that they support labor market needs. Before the pandemic hit, we spent a great deal of time thinking about the future of work. A very different future confronts us. We're not sure exactly what it's going to look like, but some of the issues we discussed pre-pandemic still resonate. How will technology transform our workplaces? And what will that mean for the serious skills gaps that were already a curb on growth in so many countries? How will the demand for labor in such key sectors as healthcare, sectors already characterized by a high degree of labor mobility, how will they be met? How can we address informality and irregular migration so that we can satisfy labor demands and still protect vulnerable workers? So here to help us grapple with these issues in our region are these senior business representatives and distinguished experts from the ranks of the International Organization of Employers. We're very pleased to have with us today Fabio Macis from Costa Rica. Fabio is the Executive Director of the Costa Rican Union of Chambers and Associations of the Private Business Sector, which wins the prize, I think, of the longest organization title in the IOE. It's UCCAEP. In other words, it's the National Employers Organization of Costa Rica. Fabio is a lawyer and master in commercial law. He previously has worked in the Congress of Costa Rica and was the executive director of the Chambers of Info Communication and Technology. Secondly, we have Guido Ricci from Guatemala. Guido is Director of Labor Affairs for CACIF, the apex business organization in his country. He is a practicing lawyer and university professor, and he serves on the governing body of the ILO. Finally, Fernando Llanes from Mexico, who is also a lawyer and GB member. He specializes in labor and employment law, which he now teaches at the graduate level. He is the president of the Social Security and Human Resources Commission of CONCAMIN, Mexico's largest business representative organization. All of our panelists represent organizations whose membership consists of companies of all sizes from all sectors of the economy. So I think they're very well placed to give you a fairly comprehensive view of the impact of COVID on labor mobility and the problems that that has caused. Together, we're going to address the themes laid out in the concept note and already mentioned by Maria Paz. Our conversation is going to be followed by a Q&A in which you will have a chance to pose your own questions. And finally, I believe we'll be submitting a short summary of our presentations here for use by governments in their ongoing discussions. So let me get started with a first question to Fabio, and I invite other panelists when Fabio has finished his brief remarks to join in and add their own comments. Fabio, how has COVID impacted the future of work discussion in Costa Rica as it applies to labor migration? In other words, how should policymakers be thinking now of such issues as skills gap, educational reforms, labor shortage in the context of COVID?
Muy buenos días. En primer lugar, deseo agradecer la amable invitación que se nos.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank you for the kind invitation for the private sector to participate, and thank you to all the members. And I would like to thank Ronnie, Fernando, and Guido. Without a doubt, COVID has affected our country significantly. Costa Rica has not escaped from this sad reality. And as the private sector, I think we should start working hard in getting out of the box. Is there something that we've learned is that we cannot keep on doing the same. We need to be disrupted. And of course, the technological aspect is, as we can see today, a very important part of our day-to-day. We need to get used to it. We should not be afraid. And evidently, this is going to entail a stronger dialogue with the different sectors in relation to COVID. The corporate sector has been strong to express that regarding health, we have been doing the right thing, in some cases, but when it comes to the economic aspect, there's a lot to be done. I think that we have presented 3 economic proposals to help reactivate the economy. However, as of date, we have not gotten an answer from the executive branch. So unfortunately, this had affected us. In Costa Rica, we, on behalf of the government, there is a scheme that's called the Dance and the Hammer. So as a private sector, we have tried to have more opening of the commercial sector and tourism, because from, I think, overnight, we went to 0 income, as I mentioned on the previous panel. I think someone from the UNDP mentioned we need to adapt, of course, but this has significantly affected everything that is work related, because we went from a 12% unemployment 3 months ago or 4 months ago, March, to 24%. So I think that we need to find solutions. As Madeline Albright said, that we are talking about the 21st century, but they're providing solutions that date to the 19th century, and this, we cannot accept that. So, okay, I think that we're running out of time, so that's it for me.
Guido, are you nodding?
Bueno, nada más mencionar que
I would just like to mention that in addition to the loss of employment that we have in all our countries, I think that we should also be aware of all the companies that are shutting down. It's hard to recover them because they get lost on the small and medium-sized companies. Their economies are weak and they have no support on behalf of the government. So I think that no effort would be enough to stop the loss of jobs. That's all I wanted to say.
Want to speak on this topic?
Sí, muchas gracias, Ronnie. Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Yes, thank you for the invitation, and I would like to greet everyone and to the panel. I heard all from everyone, so I think that this dialogue from the corporate sector might become a permanent dialogue, hopefully, because I think it should be the right focus in order to find common solutions to common problems. I agree with what Fabio said, without a doubt. I think that keep on doing the same is going to give us the same results, because I think that many people have said that this is I don't know, unveiling the results that, or the problems that we've had for quite some time, because the proposals that we had, I don't know, I think that there are things that we have not implemented, and I think that this is the time to start doing something, and there are some positive things, and I think that this dialogue is important, and these are things that we could put on the table. And Fabio also expressed his concern about this COVID crisis has affected the formal sector, because I mean unemployment went to 12 to 24%, and in some economies like our countries we have the same problem, but we also have the problem with the other sectors like informality. So we need other solutions. So in our perspective, I think that this has been one of the sectors that have been more affected by COVID. Thank you.
Thank you. We will get to informality, I think, in a moment. But first, Guido, let me ask you to say a few words on the issue of remittances. We know that remittances have taken a big hit in the pandemic. And this must be an important economic issue for countries such as Guatemala. Could you say a few words about the role remittances have played and what together the private sector and the government can do to address this problem?
Yes, thank you, Ronnie. Maybe the starting point here would be the historic part. Well, we in the private sector have been part of the involvement of this phenomena for, I don't know, maybe 4 decades due to different reasons than the migration that we have today. Back then, they were talking about migration due to violence because we were at war. But nowadays, we have, I don't know, 5 times the migration. It has been exponentially, but due to other reasons that are more economically related. So we need to take that into mind when it comes to the solutions. For Guatemala, remittances and the same for other countries in the region, well, they are important because we are talking about, I don't know, they represent 10% of the GDP in our country. So I think that it is very important. It's significant. So we think that today, first, I think that we don't have enough information. Yes, well, we know with some certainty where they come from and where they use them, the amount of remittances as well. As I said, they account for 10%, and these figures come from the central bank. But we need to land those figures, or because we don't know where they are invested in, or where is the positive effect. Because if we, as a country or as the private or corporate sector, had the clarity of where they are invested in, maybe we could better cooperate in the design of policies that would allow us to have a better, I don't know, economy to receive these remittances when it comes to the consumption, or I don't know, in other sectors of the economy, because this might not be the best solution for the problem. So we have made some proposals both at the origin and destination of the remittances to aim at reducing the costs, because I think that they are still too high when it comes to the transfer costs. But we still think that this flow of remittances could, in one hand, promote savings and also dynamize the income of these people, or to take them to the regular sectors, so that they would be like a formal sector to promote the development of these communities in the long term, because we see this advantage in this sense. Why? Because in one hand, we would be like promoting a future for these people, for the migrants. And we would also be able to close this vicious circle for this undesirable migration, this migration that is forced because they are looking for better conditions, because we would have a better development in these communities. And when it comes to COVID, of course, we are concerned because we know, because they are these communities that depend on these remittances, because the whole population, they are in a productive age. There's no viability for the future for the whole community. And we also have some figures, and I was reading on some media that the generation of remittances, in spite of in some cases, they have not been able to solve the problem in some communities in spite of the high remittances. So the idea for us is to develop these policies that would allow for a better investment in the long term for these communities.
I heard several things. We need better data. We need to get a handle on, or would help to get a handle on the costs of transferring, and that technology will help. But all of that in the context of economies not being so dependent, 10% of GDP on remittances. So thank you. Fernando and Fabio, do you have anything to add from your perspectives on this subject?
Well, thank you. I think that what Guido mentioned is really important. And I think that this would be one of the things that we should look at to improve the migration conditions in our countries. For Mexico, remittances represent an important income. However, our workers abroad, well, many of them are unprotected. And I think that this is the reason why the efforts carried out are not individual. I think that we should have a regional effort to understand the problem as a whole and to find solution mechanisms. But I do share Guido's vision 100%.
Did you want to add anything on this subject?
Sí.
Yes, I think that remittances, there are two sides to the coin, and without a doubt, international labor migration is a very important engine to the economy in many countries. In the case of Costa Rica, remittances are not as significant as in our neighboring countries. I think that migration is important in our country, and without a doubt, this is something that we need to look at from both sides, but we see how the international labor migration is a key factor for sustainable migration, and it's important.
Touched on or tangentially the issues of informality and plight of undocumented workers. But let me ask you, Fernando, to go into this subject a little bit more deeply. Many countries rely on migrant labor, particularly in specific sectors such as agriculture. And in these sectors, the issues of informality and the plight of undocumented workers is particularly severe. What would be your advice from a Mexican perspective to immigration authorities to ensure that these workers can move in a safe and orderly manner and that their rights are fully respected?
Muchas gracias, Ronnie. La pregunta identifica.
Thank you, Ronnie. I think that this is a real situation, and I think that we should start from the premise, from a simple premise, which is the recognition that there is we have offer and demand when it comes to work in both countries of origin, of transit, and of destination. In the face of the economic crisis that we currently live in, it's great news, I would say, to the extent that we know how to manage labor mobility. Unfortunately, this apparently perfect equation of offer and demand, well, in the current situation, the results have not been good due to different reasons that we are all familiar with. Well, to answer to your question, first, I would like to say that there is no effective mechanism where we have the participation of the workers, the governments, with an efficient participation of offer and demand. This mechanism should be able to detect and register the good practices that would identify mainly in our region with particular characteristics, enabled to attain efficient migration systems that would allow for the fair and ethical recruitment with efficient and positive results for everyone. And I think that this mechanism should also recognize that the challenges and areas for opportunity for migration and the problems are with multiple factors and are everyone's responsibility. And I would like to mention some of them. Government. Many workers that go into Mexico to work on the field, And I think that this is not the biggest migration, even though the most visible one do so through a refugee visa. And it turns out that we do not have enough migration centers in the places where we require that labor. In addition to the fact that these offices, and we must recognize that they do not have the capacity to support the workers and employees. So many of these workers leave their countries without documents. They do not have identification documents. So it's hard for them to go into Mexico legally. So they use irregular mechanisms, and of course, they end up in informality. They do not have, I don't know, a culture of compliance. So when they end up into a company, if they have access to formal mobility, they go from one side to the other because of the absence of a mechanism for control. So for the companies, at the end of the day, if they don't have the labor, but they have the demand, but there are no adequate mechanisms for articulation, they just take these workers under any conditions. We are aware that some companies do not care about these practices, but some others would like to do the right thing, but they don't have the right mechanisms. So the results, well, bad practices, violation of human rights, and so on. So to answer to your question, we need to make an effort on regional articulation with the participation of everyone in order to link offer and demand and look for the ethical articulation and to look after the workers so that we can take advantage of this development offered by migration in these times of crisis. Thank you, Ronnie.
So if I understand you correctly, in sum, one of the best ways to address the problem of undocumented workers and informality is to create legal pathways that they can take advantage of and that employers can utilize. Is that correct?
Correcto. Y un mecanismo de articulación.
Yes, and also an articulation mechanism. We need to articulate offer and demand.
Fabio, did you want to say something on this subject?
Sí.
Yes, I would like to add that it's important to have employment public services. As Fernando said, these services are very important for the international workers' mobility because these would help to look after the offer and demand issues, because in developed countries this works well and there is also information, but in our case, unfortunately, well, this is not the case. And last year I went to an event in Colombia regarding migration, and they emphasized the importance of this. And in the case of Costa Rica, we conducted a survey on sustainable enterprises, and migrants always come into the country with the desire to learn and to start something.
Guido, did you want to intervene on this point?
Gracias, Ronnie. Simplemente
Thank you, Ronnie. I would just like to support what Fernando said. I think that's very accurate. To protect the rights of workers, Maria Paz already mentioned during her introduction this need. And we also have some interesting background regarding all these controller programs in Canada and the US, but I don't think there's a majority unfortunately, because when we have this type of borders in Guatemala that are not that tight, but I think a mechanism like the one Fernando proposed to take advantage of this current crisis and the seasonality in the agricultural sector, I think that this would be a very important opportunity.
Thank you. Gita, let's stick with you. We often use the word migration in different senses. In other words, sometimes we're referring to internal migration within a country's borders, for example, rural to urban migration. Sometimes we're talking about cross-border migration between neighboring countries. And sometimes we mean it in a more regional or even an international sense. Could you talk about Guatemala's experience with any or all of these different forms of migration? What lessons do you think policymakers should derive from the differences or the similarities in these kinds of migration experiences? We don't.
Well, thank you for the question, Ronnie. Guatemala is a country where we have migration, and it's also a country of transit. So traditionally, we have developed the policies for this phenomena. Well, we want to protect those in transit and our citizens that I don't know, those who go through Mexico go to the US, and I think that that's the right focus. But I think that we no longer give the importance to the other side of the coin, because we need to look for the causes of migration. For example, economic causes, but also those that are coming back from a migration experience that, I don't know, they can contribute from their experiences. And I think that we should have a more complete strategy. And I think that this goes back to your question about internal migration, because studies tell us that most of those that think about migrating due to economic reasons, their first option is precisely what you mentioned, internal migration. I don't know, to the more developed cities in their surroundings, and this is where unfortunately they find a lack of opportunities, and then they find this need to migrate towards, I don't know, the cross-border migration. So I think that a good idea would be to think about a strategy of, I don't know, before this cross-border migration, they should think about, I don't know, these people in smaller towns to think about better opportunities, because we need, of course, as we mentioned before, to have, I don't know, a better, good financing sources. When we were discussing remittances, we need to have, to design better policies to deal with these, of course, and we need to have better incentives that would allow to employment generating companies to go to these intermediate cities, to call them something. But without the adequate infrastructure, in spite of all the incentives, these companies would not relocate. So we need to think about the infrastructure. We need to have training, because we have labor. But what kind of labor? Unfortunately, this is not qualified labor in most cases. So we need to think also about the characteristics, not only about the language, but also about technology. So we need to consider all the different skills so that we can have a complete training program to take advantage of the new technologies. And something that we were discussing with Fabio. We need to do things differently. We need to adapt to the needs of the 21st century. And based on these elements that we have been mentioning, we need to come up with a more complete policy to promote this internal migration, but focusing on cities that can be development cities or points.
Guido, is that what we need is a whole of government approach. That looking at migration in a little, just a narrow lens of migration policy is not enough. It's a bigger economic issue. Moreover, education, infrastructure, technological development, and so on are all pieces of this puzzle, so that migration is a choice, not a necessity. Even prosperous, developed countries will always have people who want to leave, to go elsewhere for a whole array of reasons. And that's a good thing for economies. But hopefully, governments will be designing their migration policy in the context of economic policies that create enough prosperity so that people will not have to leave their own countries. And many people would prefer to stay rather than migrate for economic reasons. So Fabio and Fernando, would you like to come in on this subject before we go to our final round of questions? Fabio?
Fernando, I don't know if you'd like to go first. Just briefly, I think that this is an interesting position so that you can take advantage within your own country of the talent of people. And as Ronnie said, I think that it's a free choice if you'd like to migrate to a different country. I think that I don't know, generating this development poles that need not be the big cities, but I don't know, specific vocation cities taking advantage of the different assets that we have in our countries, in the region, within the region. I think that what Guido proposed is really important. These intermediate cities, without a doubt, along with sustainable companies with emphasis on decent jobs, would result in better opportunities. I think that economic policies, and I think that the private sector has a lot to contribute. And this should be done not only from a table, but also we need to consult and have a real dialogue with the private sector.
Well, thank you, Fabio, for teeing up the final question in this round before we go to the Q&A from other participants. I'm going to address this first to Fernando, but I'd like Guido and Fabio also to respond to this. And the question is, how can dialogue between migration authorities and the private sector be improved in your country so that migration policies are more closely linked to employment policies and labor market needs? Fernando?
Thank you. I think that in order to improve the dialogue, we must start from a strategic plan, not for each company, but a regional strategy where all governments, workers, and employers should have the same rules, the same guarantees, the same rights, the same obligations. And I think that economic crisis, mainly it is a pandemic, offer opportunities that we should take advantage of. We should take the needs we have in order to implement this plan that should have public policies. And even though governments sometimes think that some things are not sustainable from an economic standpoint, I think that in the long run, if we have mechanisms, for example, for people's identities that are simple in this migration pathway that you clearly summarized from my intervention, I think that we can have this ethical recruitment, and this would prevent bad practices and eliminate the costs from this chain of inefficiencies that all participants mentioned, that would result in a waste of benefits represented by migration, and which I think that are currently an important factor to come out of this crisis that would be a success in the region. And I want to recognize that we have everything in our region, so we need to put things in order. And I would insist in this strategic plan at regional level. Thank you, Ronnie. I hope I answered your question.
To ask you, are in Mexico, and I'll ask this question of Guido and Fabio as well, are there formal consultative mechanisms through which the private sector and indeed other actors in society can discuss with the government issues around in migration policy? Or are the channels?
Desde luego que sí. Sí, desde luego que sí. En México.
Yes, of course. CONCAMIN, which is the association I belong to, is the organism for this consultation. And we also have an agreement for decent work with this participation of the federal government for the workers and the organization for workers and employers. And evidently, one of the objectives of decent work is migration and human rights of workers. And of course, we can have a mechanism for this. But what we are lacking is this coordination at regional level for all these efforts to be directed towards the same goal.
Sí, me parece que Fernando da en el.
Yes, I think that Fernando is right when it comes to regional coordination. However, it is evident that we first need to have national coordination. And as for the consultation mechanisms, when it comes to migration, the regulations in Costa Rica, before they are published, they need to be consulted with the different sectors. So the chambers do so first. And as for the government, when it comes to public policies, I think that a good practice is the one that we have been working on this year through one of our affiliated chambers, which is the National Chambers of Agriculture. And they have promoted a decree to help the work of people when they come during the harvest season for coffee, melon, oranges. They need to establish in to be established in the country for a certain period of time legally while they work. And this generates some sort of a formality, and afterwards they can go back to their countries. And I understand that this is also the case in some neighboring countries, like in Honduras, where they program this with Guatemala, Salvador, and Nicaragua, so they can come for seasonal jobs, and then they can go back to their countries.
That we talked about that help prevent informality and the problems of undocumented workers. Guido, we're going to give you the last word in this part of the program. Go ahead.
Gracias, Ronnie. De acuerdo.
Thank you, Ronnie. As Fernando and Fabio said, well, I agree. And as for your question, in Guatemala, for the past 15 years, we have a law for this. We don't have this obligation for consultation, but I think this should be the right practice. I'm not sure about this because I am not aware of this, but I think that it should be done through this mechanism. But I think that, but in Guatemala, we have ratified Agreement 154 from ILO. So when it comes to anything related to international labor standards, we should be consulted, and we have this forum for this. But I think that when it comes to migration, we have many things, but as for more formal mechanisms, I don't think we don't have them. But the vision that Fernando mentioned is important. We should have national mechanisms, but this is a regional or Mesoamerican mechanism. So we should have a forum that would allow us to have this interaction. And I understand that there is a proposal for this entrepreneurial Mesoamerican mechanism to IOM in order to have a strategic alliance that would allow for this a dialogue and the sharing of ideas. And I think that this is going to solve this need to a certain extent.
Thank you, and thank you all. It's now time for our Q&A session, and I'm going to hand over to the RCM to moderate the questions.
Muchas gracias, Ronnie. Gracias a don Guido, a don Fabio y a don Fernando.
Thank you, Ronnie, Guido, Fabio, and Fernando. Thank you, Ronnie, for being a moderator. So please stay online. We're going to start with the Q&A session. Fabio Jimenez from IOM already reminded you that you can ask your questions on the messaging tab, or you can request to speak on the lower right corner. We would like to invite you to make your questions. We will now give the floor to our colleague. Thank you, Luis, and thank you, Ronnie, Fabio, Guido, and Fernando. Excellent participation. I think that this is going to result in an excellent participation on behalf of other organizations of employers. Luis, I would like to remind you that this is the first webinar of a series of 3. We will meet the next week with a series of initiatives of public-private associations, and we'll end these sessions on September 2nd with a series of tools from UNDP, ILO, and IOM that are offered to the governments and other organizations. So some of the proposals and subjects that have been made by the panel members will be mentioned during the next sessions. Thank you, Luis. Thank you. I'd like to remind you that today I would like to greet all the international organisms and observers that work in assisting those that are most vulnerable. And there is no coincidence that we have here because we are members of the RCM and these are the causes that we represent. First, we're going to listen to Lorenzo Roel from the Comeremex. He has a question. You can open your microphone. Well, more than a question, I would like to congratulate Fernando, Guido, Fabio. And I think that it's important, regardless of the social dialogue in our countries, we need to have regional agreements with the countries, because I think that one of the problems that we have in our countries regarding migration is precisely the lack of regulations and I think that this is going to allow us to have a better follow-up on the formality and to respect the rights of the workers. And I think that we would have to address everything in order to improve all these policies. Thank you. Thank you for your comment. The first question that we have in the chat, Dolores Ortega would like to ask Fabio what measures to support, now that we have 24% unemployment, will be offered by the government. You need to activate your microphone. As Marcelo said at the beginning, tomorrow ION will be broadcasting live the findings of the survey from COVID on effects on migrants at 2 p.m. Central American time. And we'll have all the findings of the COVID effects on the migrant population. Fabio? Thank you. The measures that the government will take, or what we have proposed. What are the measures offered by the government? Well, the government has presented some proposals. Last week, they presented a new proposal last week. To try to reduce the unemployment rate, and they have presented some economic measures. However, as I said in the beginning, we think that some of the measures that we have requested would be more helpful. They are simple. For example, we are close to the US tourism markets, and I think this is the main generator for us when it comes to tourism, and we have insisted in the opening of the by respecting, of course, all protocols, but we needed to open shops in order for people to be able to the different shops. And as I said before, when it comes to the so-called dance and hammer, this has resulted in a very high unemployment rate, and evidently this this has affected migrants, nationals, and the government has opened a digital channel where they are requesting all citizens to submit their ideas for economic reactivation. Well, it's a dialogue, and I think that this is positive, but it would be more important to work in what we need to do today, because as Fernando said earlier, we do not have companies at the hospital. What we have is a cemetery, and I think that this is not positive in a country like ours. Thank you, Fabio. We have another question. Armando Ortecho says, why don't we apply Kafka measures for free mobility like in the US? I don't know if Guido or Fernando would like to answer, or to refer to Kafka and free mobility of people in the region. Or maybe Armando would like to tell us who the question is addressed to. Well, I would like to take advantage to say, or to go to what Marcelo said during the three proposals, and one of which was the strengthening of the regulatory framework. And now that Armando is going back to this similar circumstance on the regulatory framework, I think that we need to be careful when it comes to regulating things, because the purpose is facilitating things or ensuring or guaranteeing the rights of workers or companies or the safety and health of people. And we end up hindering migration or making it more difficult, and opening opportunities for the coyotes in Mexico, or bad practices that are simpler and more efficient than the right way of doing things. So we need for the regulatory frameworks and the decisions we make to facilitate things. So I wanted this opportunity to express that opinion. Thank you, Fernando. I would like for Jaime Bustamante to ask a question. You can open your mic and activate your video. Can you identify yourself, please? Yes, I am Jaime Bustamante. I am Vice President of the Labor Commission of Coparmex in Mexico. And I have the opportunity to work on some previous sessions with all of you. So my question specifically is in relation to the policies that should be implemented by the different countries within the region regarding employer organizations that want to make some adjustments before labor migrations on how to develop strategies for migrant workers to be better trained, and how to promote alignment between the skills and migration strategies, and how to address or bridge gaps for the protections of migrant workers' rights, and how to better use direct or soft hiring or direct hiring, because I think that this is some of the things that we look at, and I think that this is applicable in general in the region. So this is what I would like to ask. I would like to understand how are we going to face these new challenges during COVID-19 and migration in these days. Thank you. Jaime, who would like to answer this question? Or Ronnie, would you like to answer to this question? Thank you.
The panelists will jump in. Let me say, Jaime, I think
Bueno, si me permiten, yo nada más mencionar que dentro del plan estratégico articulador que he puesto sobre la mesa como
Well, I would like to propose that we need all the conditions that Jaime mentioned, whom I'd like to read right away. I mean, the certification of skills, the search for regional vocations that each country or population has, and then take advantage of all the skills of the workers out on the field to guide them through the places where these skills are needed. Because, for example, Mexico and Canada, for over 35 years, they have had this strategic plan through which we send a group of workers during certain times of the year for I don't know, specific harvests. And this has worked because workers go to Canada and they go where they are hired. They do not migrate to other companies. They do not escape because they know that next year or the next harvesting season, they have the opportunity to go back. And the employer knows that that worker has the skills required to perform that job. So I think that the national employment offices in the different countries can do a lot. And I think that companies like the one Jaime represents, I think that if we had mechanisms to certify the abilities, I think that this would be very useful to reduce costs and expenses represented by migration, because everyone knows or thinks that hiring migrants would save you money, but I think it's more expensive from any standpoint because of healthcare, housing, and any costs represented by visa, transportation. I think that it's something that we should guide, and as Jaime mentioned, I insist this should be a part of a strategic regional plan with the involvement of everything he mentioned. Gil? Thank you. I just wanted to add to what Fernando said, that I agree. From a national perspective, I think that this proposal, from the perspective of the private sector in my country, we have specific proposals for economic reactivation, and it's similar to what Jaime said, but what we are lacking might be a strong component when it comes to training and labor reconversion. For example, we need to be up to the circumstances, and I think that this should be a complete vision, as Jaime mentioned. But this is something that we have been working on, and we have proposals on the table, and many of them have been gathered by all the organisms. Thank you, Guido. Thank you, Jaime. Ronnie, you wanted to say something?
This kind of highlights the key role that employer organizations are playing and can play in the areas that the other panelists have mentioned: skills recognition, qualifications, and so on. And I think emphasizes the size of the resource that employer organizations offer to governments in a variety of ways that we've been addressing today.
Muchas gracias, Ron.
Thank you, Ronnie. Jonathan Monge from the Ministry of Labor in Costa Rica comments that it's important to regulate and provide social and security when it comes to digital information, and also the participation of the different sectors to motivate the use of official channels when it comes to the recruitment of foreigners, and this should all be included on the same system. Thank you for your comment. Dolores Ortega asks, before this adverse situation, do you foresee a greater migration, and what can we do as common citizens? I think that this is a challenging question. I don't know who would like to answer. Fabio? Fabio, maybe you can refresh your screen, or in the meantime, Armando Urtecho says that regarding people's mobility, or Fabio? I apologize, but something happened. I just wanted to say, in relation to prospection, that as I mentioned in that public services, I think that the National Employment Agency, I think, should be stronger. I think that this was part of the Ministry of Labor. I think that this was part of the Presidential House of the National Learning Institute. Those of you who are not familiar with that, I think that these are the kind of agencies that can give us more clear information. And this is something that we expressed last year, that having two offices regarding the same topic is not adequate. I think that Jonathan is right, because we need the legal security, just like it happened with the agro-industrial sector. We need to have prospection information. We need to be clear regarding migration, and we need to have the decrees and anything that we need in order to have clarity. Thank you, Fabio. Armando or Fernando, you want to add something? I just wanted to mention regarding the question about common citizens and how are they affected by migration. I think that migration is a relief for unemployment in some countries of origin, because they cannot find a job, so they migrate to a place where they can find a job. And I think that this helps common citizens to regulate employment in their country. So from that standpoint, I think that migration helps everyone, and I think it's important for everyone. And I think that we don't have much time, and Armando Urtecho was asking about the free trade agreements, and there's another challenging question regarding how can we expedite. Well, there's a signing of agreements to expedite the exchange of goods and services, but what can we do to expedite the free mobility of migrant workers? Because we know that free trade agreements include clauses regarding the recruitment of foreign labor and some specific jobs that are incorporated on the free trade agreements. So I don't know if anyone would like to refer to this balance that we need regarding goods and services, but also people, when we talk about labor mobility. well, if you allow me, I think that it's very complex to combine one and the other because trade agreements refer to trade as it says, but I don't think it refers to people. But now they are including things about workers in the country that the agreement was signed with because they don't want, I don't know, they need to comply with all the obligations and but I think that they should have like a parallel agreement related to people because they are talking about unfair competition and things like that. But I don't think that I think it's hard to include people as part of the agreement. I think that it should be further analyzed because when Armando asks a question, it's because he's familiar with it. And I think that we should understand his proposal. But I think in my opinion, it's hard to combine both. Thank you, Fernando. And finally, Octavio Carvajal from Concamín, Mexico. Well, he congratulates all participants and comments about the facilities that should be included in the social security system, and mentions that everything should be considered when it comes to labor risks. And Ronnie, you wanted to say something?
Something on the previous question. I think we have to be realistic. Trade agreements are often very political and politicized negotiations and controversial in their countries. I don't know of any that really addresses in any comprehensive way the issue of movement of people. And while I agree that that's a fundamental flaw, perhaps, or fundamental missing part, I don't think that anytime soon we're going to see either at the international level or in many countries, agreements that really fully address the movement of personnel. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't explore and exploit whatever other channels in bilateral agreements, in sectoral agreements, in regional facilities to handle parts of the problem. But I think the prospects of any kind of comprehensive solution to this problem are probably quite far down the road. So I hope I'm not ending this panel on a negative note.
Muchas gracias, Ronnie. No, todo lo contrario, más bien un balance.
Thank you, Ronnie. It's a very positive balance with all your comments and questions and all the comments of the members of the panel whom we would like to thank for the quality of your interventions. And now I would like to give the floor to Fabio. No, I think that Fabio and Fernando would like to make a final comment. Well, in the case of Octavio, I would like to say hello. And I think that it's really important, social security and occupational health in relation to migrant workers. And fortunately, in our countries, due to all, well, in our countries, it's almost impossible due to all this bureaucracy and paperwork. Well, it's difficult to think about the future after COVID because all the state institutions, when it comes to social security, need to make some changes regarding how we see things currently, because otherwise we're going to keep on having an important informality regarding these workers. Fernando? I just wanted to refer to this last topic mentioned by our colleague, not only regarding social security in general, because housing and maybe one of the most relevant aspects can be pensions. Many workers spend, well, Mexicans go to the US for years, and when they get back at 65, they come back to the country of origin, Mexico, and they might come back with some savings, and that would be good, but they might not have the right to a pension because the non-contributing pensions are not going to solve anyone's problems. But I think, and I would like to put on the table, I would like to take advantage of this opinion on behalf of Octavio. I think that we might not solve these problems, but I think that it's going to be difficult to talk about ethical migration. We should consider the return to their countries of origin, and because sometimes they'll return to their countries, and I think that we should consider this situation. So I would invite the organizers to come up with a deep diagnose when it comes to this, and maybe we should align all these topics. It might seem complicated, but I think that we should align all the systems. Mexico has some agreements, for example, with Spain. It is not going to solve the problem, but there is some progress has been made when we have some rules that applied, and there is some space for reflection. But we're not going to, if we don't solve this, we're not going to solve the migration problem. Thank you. Thank you. We'll take note of all of these, and we'll document all these comments. Thank you, Luis. And before listening to Michela for the closing remarks, I would like to remind you that I included a link on the chat to a small survey that we normally conduct at the beginning. It's just a few questions that you can quickly complete that are going to really help us develop for the next couple of sessions. We are going to provide you with some examples of some countries that are implementing some measures on good practice and recommendations on some things that we mentioned today on labor migration on the agricultural sector, and also about the use of prospective studies on the offer, demand, and some things. And I think that the next session on next week are going to provide some specific examples that maybe that Ronnie and some other members discuss. So I would like to invite you to take a look at it. And in 2 weeks, we're going to see other interesting topics. I would like to thank everyone's participation, panel members, organizations, colleagues from IOE, UNDP, RCM, IOM, ILO. And I would like to invite you to participate next week. Michela, would you like to make some final comments? Yes, thank you, Fabio, panel members, Ronnie. This has been a very interesting and promising panel. All these suggestions that you made have been interesting. I would like to make a brief comment regarding the things that were discussed that are a response to the proposals made, particularly to a comment that Fernando made regarding the lack of a mechanism to articulate offer and demand. I would like to emphasize that the International Organization for Migration has developed a mechanism that does precisely that. And in the words of our colleague Guido Ricci, it is an innovative mechanism that responds with the words of the 21st century. It's called the EASE, And it proposes the application in practice of ethical recruitment so that it's fair for employers, fair for migrants, and fair for recruiters. It's a win-win situation for everyone that participates. Governments will not continue to exploit migrants and will not shed a negative light on everyone that they want to do right, and employers. And it has been developed by us because we found a lack of clarity on international recruitment, and we are applying this tool already in countries in the region, starting with Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador. So when you mentioned the strategic plan, I thought that this is going to give us the possibility to build something concrete. I'm not going to tell you more because, as Fabio said, we're going to discuss this tool during the next couple of sessions on the 26th of August about the importance of the intersectorial cooperation, where I am going to present this tool. And also on September 2nd, where we're going to introduce these tools that we have that work with concrete examples for you to understand how it works in practice for everyone involved. Thank you again, and it has been an excellent panel. Congratulations. Thank you, Michaela. Once again, I would like to thank everyone, Ronnie, Guido, Fernando, Fabio, and Fabio Jimenez. Also, Mrs. Encerrigui, the IOE, for joining this conference, UNDP, and as Michaela said, we'll see you next week. I would also like to thank the interpreter for helping us this morning, and our colleague, Renan Ronas. See you in our next session. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.